She begged for death. But death sent her something worse. Someone who refused to let her die. The ruins of Ashworth Manor exhaled cold into Margaret's lungs as she pressed herself against the stone wall, her swollen belly a betrayal that echoed through the darkness. 7 months. 7 months of carrying a child whose father had taken his own life 3 weeks after their wedding, leaving her with nothing but scandal, debt, and the suffocating pity of a village that had already decided her story. The November rain fell in sheets, and she could hear the hunt dogs baying beyond the iron gates. Her husband's brother, Edmund, and his men. They had come for the child. They had come to take what remained of her husband's legacy, which meant taking the baby from her womb and placing it in the hands of wet nurses who would raise it to despise its mother's name. Margaret had run. She had stolen a horse from the stable, ridden through moorland until her thighs burned and her waters threatened to break, and found these ruins, what remained of an abbey destroyed centuries ago by fire and time. The stones still bore the char marks of that ancient violence. She sank lower, her palm pressed against her lower back, where the child kicked with relentless insistence. The baby knew. Even in the darkness, even in her terror, the child within her thrashed like something fighting to escape its own existence. "Please," she whispered to the emptiness, "please let me keep you." That was when she heard the footsteps, not the heavy boots of Edmund's men. These steps were measured, deliberate, almost weightless against the wet stone. Margaret held her breath, and the child inside her went still, as if even the unborn could sense the shift in the night's temperature. A figure emerged from the fog that clung to the abbey's broken archways. Tall, dark coat that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. His face was obscured until he stepped closer, and Margaret saw the architecture of something beautiful and ruined. Sharp cheekbones, eyes that held centuries behind them, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. He stopped 3 paces away from her. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice carried an accent she couldn't place, something Eastern European, something that suggested he had walked through empires that no longer existed. "Not much, but enough that I can hear it." Margaret's hand flew to her temple. Rain and sweat had made her skin slick, and yes, there was blood, a small cut from when she had fallen against the stone trying to hide. "Don't come closer," she whispered, though her body made no move to run. Where would she run? The child was too heavy now. She was too tired. She was too much a coward to actually want to escape. The man tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something beyond her hearing. "They're looking for you, the men on horseback." "How did you—" "I can hear their voices 3 miles east. I can hear the panic in your pulse from where I stand. I can hear the child inside you, Margaret, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that she knows you're terrified." The precision of his knowing stopped her breath. He had said she. He had said her name without her speaking it. "What do you want?" Margaret asked, and her voice was smaller than she intended. The man stepped out of the fog entirely now, and in the moonlight she could see the intelligence in his eyes, not cruelty, but something more dangerous. Recognition. As if he was looking at her and seeing not just a pregnant woman hiding in ruins, but every version of herself she had ever been or would become. "I want to know," he said slowly, "if you're willing to survive the night." He removed his cloak, a garment of deep black velvet lined with something that caught the starlight like captured silver, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body. It carried a scent like old libraries and winter stone. "My name is Casimir," he said, "and I have not saved anyone in 43 years. So I suggest you tell me your name quickly, before I remember why I stopped bothering." The dogs howled in the distance, closer now, and Margaret, who had spent 7 months preparing for death, felt something crack open inside her chest. Not hope. Hope was too fragile for a widow carrying another man's unwanted child. But something, a choice, a moment where the story could fracture into something other than its ending. Margaret, she breathed. Margaret Ashworth. And the child is named Eleanor. Casimir's eyes closed for a moment, as if the weight of two names had cost him something irreplaceable. Then Eleanor will be born into a world that tried to kill her before she drew her first breath, he said. And you, Margaret Ashworth, are going to learn that some monsters keep their promises better than gods ever could. He took her hand, his skin impossibly cold, and pulled her deeper into the ruins, into the darkness where the hunt could not follow, into a night that would rewrite everything she thought she knew about survival, sacrifice, and the terrible mercy of finding salvation in the least likely places. Behind them, the cloak's silver lining caught the moonlight one final time before the fog swallowed it whole. The hunt dogs howled, but they were howling at empty air now. The room had been a chapel once. Casimir had told her that when he led her through a passage beneath the abbey's foundations, a place where stone met earth, met something older than prayer. The vaulted ceiling still bore the ghost of frescoes. Saints with bleeding eyes, angels with broken wings, the Virgin Mary cradling a child who looked more like a prophecy of pain than an infant. It was built in 1247, Casimir said, lighting candles that appeared from nowhere in his coat pockets. Burned in 1563. Every 100 years or so, someone tries to rebuild it. Every 100 years, it returns to this. He gestured to the darkness, the dampness, the beautiful desolation. Some things refuse resurrection. Margaret sank onto a stone bench, her body trembling not from cold, but from the strange gratitude of being alive. The contractions had started an hour before they reached the chapel, not severe, but rhythmic, like a clock counting down to something she was nowhere near ready for. "How long?" she asked. Casimir knelt before her, his movements precise as ritual, and pressed his palm against her belly. His hand was so cold that for a moment she thought it would burn. Instead, it settled into the warmth of her skin, and she felt the child move toward it. Eleanor reaching for the stranger who had saved her mother's life. 4 weeks, he said. Perhaps 5. The child is not in distress. But you are. He looked at her with an intensity that felt like being truly seen for the first time in her life. You've been in pain since you were a girl, haven't you? Before the husband, before the scandal. Pain was always your default. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she didn't know she had been holding. How could you possibly know that? Because I've lived long enough to recognize the smell of a soul that's been slowly poisoned by its own family, Casimir said, standing now, moving through the chapel with the grace of someone for whom centuries had become choreography. Your father was a gambler. Your mother found comfort in laudanum. And you learned very early that love was a thing that consumed everything it touched, leaving only debt and shame in its wake. Stop, Margaret whispered. Your husband married you for your dowry and your silence. You married him, hoping that obedience might finally earn you permission to exist. Casimir lit another candle, a tall white one that filled the chapel with a scent like myrrh and old graves. And when he discovered that even your silence couldn't save him from his own dissolution, he swallowed rat poison while you slept 3 rooms away. Stop! Margaret's voice cracked, and immediately the child responded to her distress, kicking hard against her ribs. Casimir turned to face her, and in the candlelight she could see something she had missed before. Sorrow. Ancient, bone-deep sorrow that had worn itself smooth through centuries of carrying it. I speak only truth, he said quietly, because lies are the first currency of monsters, and I am trying very hard not to be that anymore. He sat beside her on the bench, leaving careful distance between them. You ran tonight, not because you were afraid of your brother-in-law. You ran because you were finally, for the first time in your life, afraid that you might survive, that this child might survive, that survival might demand something harder than the slow, dignified death of becoming a cautionary tale. Margaret's breathing came shallow and rapid. Another contraction began, low and twisting, and she pressed her fist against her abdomen, waiting for it to pass. "Who are you?" she asked when she could speak again. "What are you?" Casimir stood and walked to the chapel's eastern wall, where a broken window opened onto the moorland beyond. The rain had stopped. The stars were emerging like slowly opening eyes. "I am a man who fell in love with a woman in Prague in the year 1721, he said, his voice distant and careful. "Her name was Katerina. She was a violinist, and when she played, it sounded like God was apologizing for everything he had done wrong in creation." He paused, and Margaret could see his hand tighten against the stone. "I was dying then. Plague, consumption, the ordinary betrayals of a mortal body. She nursed me through it. She sat by my bed and played her violin while I burned with fever." Another pause. Margaret held her breath. "She saved my life by giving it to me again," Casimir continued. "But she made me promise something. She made me promise that I would use the years she was giving me, the centuries, as it turned out, to honor the ordinary people, the broken people, the ones no one saves." He turned back to face Margaret. "She died in 1743. She lived only 22 more years after she transformed me. She chose a natural death when she could have lived forever. She chose to end it because she said that eternity without choice becomes its own prison." His eyes held the ghost of that woman. Margaret could see her there, a violin held to her chin, a voice that had loved him enough to give him centuries of purpose. "Every person I've saved since then, I've saved because Katerina demanded I become something other than what I was cursed to be." "You're a vampire," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "I am the consequence of love," Casimir replied. "What you call me is merely language." Margaret felt another contraction building, this one stronger than the last. She gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white. "Why save me? You don't know me. You could have let them take the child." "Because Eleanor carries something inside her," Casimir interrupted, his voice suddenly urgent. "I can hear it. In the way her heartbeat harmonizes with yours, in the particular rhythm of her movements. She's going to be extraordinary, Margaret. She's going to be the kind of person the world will try to destroy the moment she discovers her own value." He knelt before her again, taking her hands in his impossibly cold grip. "And you're going to be the mother who teaches her that survival is an act of defiance." The contraction passed, and Margaret exhaled into the silence of the ancient chapel. "I'm afraid," she said simply. "Good," Casimir replied. "Fear means you understand the stakes. Fear means you're still human enough to know what you stand to lose." He stood, moving back to the shadows at the chapel's edge. "Sleep if you can. I will keep watch. Nothing will touch you or the child while I draw breath, and I have breath enough for eternity if necessary." Margaret lay down on the stone bench, Casimir's velvet cloak draped across her like a benediction, like a contract written in darkness. Above her, the headless saints watched from their frescoes, and somewhere in the geometry of that ancient chapel, she felt the presence of Katerina, a woman who had loved so fiercely that she had rewritten what eternity could mean. Eleanor kicked once more, as if in agreement. Outside, the moon rose over the moorland, indifferent to the miraculous and the terrible things happening in the dark. The pains came like waves breaking against a shore that had never asked for the ocean. Margaret woke in darkness, real darkness this time, not the half-dark of the chapel with its candles, but the absolute black of the hour before dawn when even God seemed to be sleeping. She knew immediately that something had changed. Her waters had broken. The contractions weren't building anymore. They were crashing, one atop another, leaving her gasping and terrified and alive in a way she had never been before. "Casimir!" she called, and he was there before the word finished leaving her mouth. Not appearing from shadow, but somehow already present, as if he had been standing vigil over her through the entire night without moving, without breathing, without being entirely real. "It's time," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the calm of someone who had witnessed countless births, countless deaths, countless transformations. "I can't," Margaret sobbed. "I can't do this. The pain." "The pain," Casimir said, kneeling beside her and taking her hands, "is Eleanor learning that the world requires you to break yourself open to survive it. She will learn that before she even draws breath. She will inherit that knowledge from your blood, your bones, your absolute refusal to let her die." He guided her hand to her own belly, pressing it there firmly. "Feel her. She's fighting already. She's fighting harder than anyone who's ever lived has fought. You think you can do any less?" What followed was hours, or perhaps minutes. Time had become elastic and unreliable, of agony and endurance that Margaret would spend the rest of her life not quite being able to articulate. She understood now why women did not speak of this. There were no words adequate to describe the moment when your body became a door, and something precious and terrifying was passing through you into the world. Casimir never looked away. He held her hand through each contraction, and she realized with a shock that felt almost holy that he was crying. Tears moving down his pale cheeks with the same inevitability as the contractions moving through her body. "Why are you crying?" she gasped between the waves of pain. "Because I haven't witnessed new life enter the world in 63 years, he said. "Because Katerina taught me that this moment, this agony, this triumph, is the only real magic that exists. Everything else is just the echo of this." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving no trace of the tears. "She said that immortals forget, that mortality knows something we never will, that to be finite is to be urgent, to be temporary is to be profound." Another contraction, and Margaret felt something shift inside her, felt Eleanor dropping lower, felt the geometry of her body reorganizing itself for this last, impossible task. "Push," Casimir commanded, and there was something in his voice, something ancient and authoritative, a voice that had commanded armies and centuries that made her body obey. And then Eleanor came into the world with a cry that sounded like a violin's first note. Casimir caught her before she could fall, supported her with hands that trembled slightly as he placed the infant against Margaret's bare chest, still tethered by the umbilical cord that connected them. Eleanor was small, improbably small, with skin the color of watered wine and dark hair plastered to her scalp. Her eyes were closed, her mouth open in that primal cry, and Margaret felt something in her chest shatter and reform into a different shape entirely. Love, so fierce and so absolute that it felt like violence. "She's perfect," Margaret wept, touching the infant's face with shaking fingers. "She's perfect and alive and she's yours," Casimir finished. He was moving now, methodical and efficient, handling the physical aftermath of birth with the competence of someone who had lived through centuries of practical necessity. "She will inherit your strength, Margaret Ashworth. She will carry in her bones the memory of this night, the night her mother chose survival over surrender." When Eleanor was clean and wrapped in cloth that Casimir produced from seemingly nowhere, when Margaret was tended to and settled on a bed of blankets and cloaks in a corner of the chapel, when the infant slept with her mouth open and her fists curled, Casimir finally stepped back. "The men are gone," he said quietly. "Your brother-in-law lost the scent at the moorland's edge. He's convinced himself you fell into the bog and drowned. By tomorrow the village will be mourning 2 widows instead of celebrating the taking of an orphan. He'll search." "Not here," Casimir said. "Not in the ruins of a place most of this region considers cursed." He paused, and in the candlelight his face looked carved from old sorrows. "I cannot stay with you forever, Margaret. I have centuries of promises to keep, and the world is vast, and I'm tired in ways that only time can make possible." He sat beside her, careful not to wake Eleanor. "But I can give you 8 weeks. I can give you the knowledge that you and your child are safe in this chapel while the winter turns and the village's attention moves elsewhere. I can give you enough supplies, food, water, medicine, to sustain both of you." "And then?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "And then you will learn to be a mother without the safety net of a man, mortal or otherwise, to catch you when you fall," Casimir said. "You will be ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously. You will teach Eleanor what Katerina taught me, that finite lives are the only ones that matter, because they demand intention. They demand love that isn't casual. They demand that we choose every moment to make the person we're becoming worth the cost." Margaret looked down at Eleanor, sleeping with the absolute confidence of someone who had no idea what the world was capable of. "What if I fail?" she whispered. "Then Eleanor will learn resilience from your failure," Casimir said, "which is its own education." He stood, his shadow falling across both of them like a benediction. "Rest now. I will keep watch. I will keep watch until the dawn breaks and the birds forget to be afraid. And now I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel and at what moments of the night they find you." Days became a rhythm Margaret had never known before. Wake, feed Eleanor, sleep, wake again. The chapel became less a place of refuge and more a place of transformation, not just of her body, which was healing in ways that felt miraculous, but of her understanding of what it meant to survive. Casimir was there and not there simultaneously. He would appear with supplies, fresh milk from a farm 3 miles away. He'd traded something, though he never said what. Bread that was still warm, herbs that he insisted she drink in tea for strength. He would hold Eleanor while Margaret bathed in the underground spring that ran beneath the chapel's foundations, and she would return to find him rocking the infant with movements so gentle they seemed to be choreography from centuries of tenderness. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked one evening, as Eleanor slept in Casimir's arms with the absolute trust of the newborn. "I had a daughter," he said quietly. "In 1799, her mother was a musician, not as talented as Katerina, but lovely in her way. I was supposed to leave after the birth, supposed to disappear into the night the way we do." He looked down at the sleeping infant. "I didn't. I stayed for 3 months, and I taught my daughter to recognize music in the rhythm of the wind and the sound of rainfall." "What happened to her?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "She lived to 78 years old and had 7 children of her own," Casimir said, and his voice carried a note of something almost like peace. "She remembered me when she was dying, and she asked her youngest grandson to find me and tell me that I had been right. That the ordinary years, the years of feeding a child and teaching her music and watching her become someone other than what I'd imagined, were worth more than all the centuries of immortality combined." He gently placed Eleanor into the crib, nothing fancy, just a wooden box lined with cloth, and stood, his back to Margaret. She also asked her grandson to tell me that she forgave me for leaving, that she understood that love sometimes means knowing when to step back and let someone else become the center of the story. He turned to face Margaret. "Your brother-in-law was in the village this morning. I heard him at the market. He stopped looking for you." The relief that flooded through Margaret was complicated by other emotions she couldn't quite name. Survival had been the goal, but now that it seemed assured, she realized she had been holding something else inside her. A question. A terrible, necessary question. "You're going to leave us," she said, not a question. "Yes," Casimir replied. "In 5 weeks, when Eleanor is 8 weeks old and strong enough that her survival no longer depends on the particular blood chemistry of a vampire's presence." He moved to the window, the same broken one where he'd stood that first night, and gazed out at the moorland. "I can feel it happening already. the pull of the world outside, the debt I owe to Katerina and to every person I promised to save. There are others dying, Margaret, others hiding in ruins, others running from men who would consume them entirely. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. She had known this, she reminded herself. She had always known this. Men like Casimir, immortal, driven by obligation, marked by centuries of necessary departures, could never stay. The most merciful thing they could do was teach you to survive without them. Teach me, she said suddenly, before you go. Teach me everything I need to know to keep her safe. Casimir turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of Katerina, that long-dead woman who had loved him enough to demand he become better than what he was cursed to be. Knowledge, he said slowly, is the only immortality available to mortals. He walked to her and took her hands. Very well. We have 5 weeks. I will teach you to defend yourself and your daughter against every threat I can imagine. I will teach you the names of women in 3 countries who will help you when you need help. I will teach you that your survival is not a burden. It's an act of defiance against everyone who ever tried to convince you that you deserved less than life. Over the following weeks, Margaret learned impossible things. She learned which plants could heal and which could kill. She learned how to move through darkness without making sound. She learned the names of safe houses in London and Dublin and Paris, networks of women, some widows, some escaped servants, some hiding their own terrible secrets, who had learned to survive on the margins of a society that would have preferred them dead. She learned that Casimir, for all his coldness and his centuries, was teaching her the language of love through practical knowledge. Every lesson was an act of faith, every skill was a gift, and Eleanor, impossibly small and impossibly resilient, grew. Her eyes opened fully by the 4th week. They were pale gray-blue, with flecks of something deeper, like looking into ancient water. She gripped Margaret's finger with the force of someone who knew exactly what she was fighting for. On the morning of the 8th week, Casimir brought clothes for Margaret and Eleanor. Practical traveling clothes, nothing fancy, but well-made and warm. "There's a woman named Catherine Blackwood in Edinburgh," he said. "She runs a boarding house for women without means or family. She owes me a debt. You can tell her I sent you. She'll find you work, probably as a seamstress or a nurse, and she'll keep your secret. She's kept other secrets far darker than yours." Margaret dressed Eleanor in tiny clothes that made her look like a porcelain doll someone had decided to animate with breath and intention. She dressed herself in the practicality of survival, and when she was ready, she looked at Casimir, standing in the doorway of the chapel with the morning light behind him, and she felt something crystallize inside her. She would survive this. Not just survive, flourish. Eleanor would have a life that Edmund's greed couldn't touch. Eleanor would learn that her mother had been broken by her world and had chosen to become steel instead. "Thank you," Margaret said. The words felt inadequate. "Don't thank me," Casimir replied. "Thank yourself. I only kept death at bay. You're the one who chose to live." He stepped into the chapel one final time and pressed his lips to Eleanor's forehead, the gesture chaste and sacramental. "You're going to be extraordinary, little one. You're going to break hearts and rebuild worlds. Your mother will teach you how." He looked at Margaret one final time, and she saw in his expression the weight of every goodbye he'd ever had to deliver, every person he'd saved and then abandoned to their own becoming. "Find yourself a good man someday," he said. "Not for protection, but for companionship. Not for completion, but for joy. The village will want you to remarry quickly. A widow with a bastard child is a scandal they'll want to consume or control. Defy them. Stay alone if you must. But don't stay alone because you believe you deserve solitude. Stay alone only if solitude is what your soul requires." "Where will you go?" Margaret asked. "There is a girl in Dublin," Casimir said. 16 years old, who has just been sold into servitude by her stepfather. There is a man in Prague who is slowly poisoning his wife for her inheritance. There is a woman in Vienna who discovered her husband is not who she believed he to be, and she needs help disappearing. He smiled, a terrible, beautiful smile. There is always someone. The world keeps manufacturing the broken and the desperate. Mercy is a never-ending labor. He turned to leave, and Margaret called out one final time. Casimir. He paused at the threshold. What did you tell Katerina? Margaret asked. When you were leaving her? What did you say? He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. I told her that I loved her enough to let her become the story's ending instead of its beginning, he said. I told her that eternity was nothing compared to the 8 years we'd had together. I told her that our daughter would carry both of us forward, his mortality and my memory, and that would be enough. He looked back at Margaret one final time. And I told her the same thing I'm telling you, that the greatest act of love is knowing when to step away and let someone else become the hero of their own life. Then he was gone, dissolving into the morning mist like something that had never quite been solid to begin with. Margaret stood in the doorway of the chapel, with Eleanor in her arms, watching the place where Casimir had disappeared, and she felt something like peace settle into her bones, not the peace of completion, but the peace of beginning. The peace of knowing that she had been broken and had chosen to survive that breaking. The peace of being utterly, terrifyingly, magnificently alone with the weight and wonder of raising a human being. She turned away from the mist and looked toward Edinburgh, toward Catherine Blackwood's boarding house, toward a future that would demand everything she had. Eleanor made a small sound, not quite a cry, more a question, and Margaret understood it instinctively. Yes, my darling, she whispered. We're ready. We've always been ready. We just needed someone to remind us. Together, they walked out of the ruins and into the world that would either break them or make them legendary. Edinburgh was a city of stone and secrets. Margaret discovered this in the first week as she moved through the narrow closes and wynds with Eleanor held against her chest, following the address Casimir had given her to a narrow building squeezed between a fishmonger and a bookbinder's shop. Catherine Blackwood was not what Margaret expected. Tall, with silver hair cut shockingly short and eyes that had witnessed traumas Margaret could only imagine, she opened the door to the boarding house and studied Margaret for a long moment before stepping back. He sent you, Catherine said, not a question. You've got his particular mark, the look of someone he's already saved once and is saving again by leaving. The boarding house was a warren of small rooms, narrow staircases, and unexpected courtyards. Catherine led Margaret through it with the ease of someone who had walked these passages 10,000 times, explaining without asking what Margaret needed: employment, anonymity, a place for Eleanor to grow up. I have a seamstress position open, Catherine said as they climbed yet another set of stairs. The work is fine and detailed, wedding gowns mostly, for women who can afford them. The pay is adequate but not generous. You'll live in the attic room above the shop. It's small, but it has a window, and it's clean. Why? Margaret asked. Why would you help a stranger Casimir sends? Catherine paused at a landing and looked back at her with something like sympathy. Because I was the stranger Casimir saved 23 years ago, she said quietly. I was being hunted by a man who believed he owned my body, my time, my choices. Casimir appeared one night when I was hiding in a cemetery, and he helped me disappear. He taught me how to build a life on the margins of society where women like us can breathe. She continued climbing. He asked only one thing in return, that I do for others what he'd done for me, that I become a station on a network of safe passage, that I never let another woman believe she had no options. The attic room was small, but blessed with a window that looked out over the city's slate rooftops toward the distant outline of mountains. Catherine helped Margaret arrange the room, a crib for Eleanor, a narrow bed for Margaret, a small desk and chair, and left her with supplies and detailed instructions on where to report for work in the morning. That first night, alone with Eleanor in the Edinburgh cold, Margaret felt the full weight of what Casimir had given her. Not safety, but the tools for survival. Not completion, but the possibility of becoming something other than what her past had demanded. She sat at the small window and looked out at the lights of the city, and she found herself thinking about her daughter's future. Eleanor would grow up not knowing her father, not remembering the chapel or Casimir or any of the circumstances of her birth. She would grow up in a city where her mother was known as a widow, a respectable enough fiction, and where she could attend school and learn to read and discover what the world held for women who dared to demand better. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Margaret's fingers grew calloused from the fine needlework, pricking blood onto expensive linen that she would have once considered impossible to touch. She learned the language of fabric and thread, the way different materials demanded different approaches, the hidden mathematics of a properly fitted seam. But it was Eleanor who truly flourished. By 6 months old, she recognized Margaret's footsteps and reached for her with hands that had learned intention. By a year, she was babbling in sounds that seemed almost musical, as if Casimir's legacy carried in her blood somehow, translating into rhythm and tone. It was in Eleanor's 2nd year that Catherine called Margaret to the parlor on an evening after work was done. "I have something for you," Catherine said, and she placed a letter on the table between them. Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately, not Casimir's, but something familiar nonetheless. She opened the envelope with shaking hands. "My dear Margaret, I am writing from Vienna, where I have helped a woman vanish from a marriage that was slowly killing her. I write this knowing that Casimir will never read these words, and yet I write them anyway, because I have discovered that immortality is not about living forever. It is about leaving traces of yourself behind that ripple outward in ways you will never fully understand. 2 nights ago, I held a child, a boy, 4 years old, and his mother asked me how I knew to save them. She asked me if someone had saved me first. I told her yes. I told her about Casimir, about the way his coldness was actually the deepest form of warmth, the willingness to care without needing to stay, to love without needing to be loved in return. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but Catherine will make sure you do. I want you to know that you are part of something larger than yourself, that Eleanor will grow up knowing, perhaps without knowing she knows it, that women like her mother are capable of transforming tragedy into triumph, that survival itself is a form of defiance. The night before Casimir left you, I asked him why he bothered. Why, after centuries, he still believed that individual acts of mercy could matter in a world so committed to cruelty. He told me something that I am now telling you, because Katerina believed that every life is a story worth saving. Every life, no matter how broken, no matter how insignificant the world deems it to be, carries something worth preserving. I save people not because it will change the world. The world is too vast and too indifferent for my mercies to matter on that scale. I save people because I love that individual person enough to believe that their life matters more than my comfort, my safety, my need to remain hidden. Eleanor will grow up to be a woman of extraordinary power, I suspect. She will inherit her mother's survival instinct and something else, something that Casimir couldn't give you, but which he gave to Eleanor through the simple act of delivering her into the world with his own hands. She will inherit permission to demand more from life than the world thinks women should want. Take care of her. Take care of yourself. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need help, find Catherine's blue door. There will be someone there who understands what it means to be saved by a vampire, only to discover that the real immortality is the work of staying alive. With deepest respect and sorrow, a friend you've never met. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box where she kept the few precious things she owned. Eleanor's birthcloth, a lock of Casimir's hair. When had she taken that, she couldn't remember. A dried flower that had been pressed into a book. Who sent it? Margaret asked Catherine. I don't know his name, Catherine said, but he comes through Edinburgh once every few years. He's one of Casimir's people, not quite immortal, but not quite mortal either. The old ones say that Casimir creates these things, half-lives they call them. People saved so thoroughly that they exist in the spaces between mortality and eternity. Catherine reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. He asked me to tell you that Eleanor's story is already becoming legend, that women in Dublin and London and Vienna are telling their daughters about the widow who hid in ruins and emerged with a child and refused to let the world tell her who she should be. That night, Margaret lay in her small attic room, listening to Eleanor sleep, and she felt the architecture of memory shifting inside her. Casimir had not promised her forever. He had promised her something more valuable, the tools to build her own forever, to transform her daughter's illegitimacy into power, to transform shame into survival instinct. She pressed her hand to the wall they shared with the bookbinder's shop, and for just a moment, she felt it, a coldness, a presence, as if Casimir himself was standing on the other side of that wall, checking on her, making sure she was truly all right. Then it passed, and she was alone again with the sound of Eleanor's breathing and the Edinburgh night pressing against the windows like something alive and watching. Eleanor was 7 years old when Margaret saw him again. It was summer, Edinburgh's version of summer, where the light lasted until nearly 10 at night, and the city felt less like a monument to cold stone and more like a place where life could happen. Margaret had stopped working for Catherine 6 months earlier, though not for the reason anyone would expect. She had saved enough money to rent a small shop at street level where she ran her own seamstress business. The shop was modest, barely large enough to fit 3 clients at a time, but it was hers. The sign above the door read, M. Ashworth, Fine Needlework, in letters she'd had painted herself, and the window displayed the kind of work that had begun to earn her reputation. Women came from Edinburgh's better neighborhoods, asking specifically for Margaret's hand on their wedding gowns, their mourning dresses, the delicate, intimate garments that required someone who understood the language of fabric and transformation. Eleanor attended a small school run by one of Catherine's network, a place where the daughters of disgraced women and quiet rebels learned to read Latin and play piano and defend themselves with words. She was precocious in ways that made Margaret both proud and terrified, as if the child understood instinctively that her life had been purchased with extraordinary circumstances and that she had to prove worthy of that purchase. It was Eleanor who saw him first. Margaret was fitting a wedding dress on a client when Eleanor pushed through the dividing curtain, her eyes wide. "Mama, there's a man outside. He's very still. He's been standing across the street for an hour." Margaret's hands stilled on the embroidery she'd been stitching. She didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. She had learned to recognize Casimir the way the body recognizes its own heartbeat, instantaneous, undeniable, beyond the reach of rational thought. She excused herself and stepped outside. He looked exactly the same. Not a day older, not a hair out of place, dressed in the same dark coat she remembered from that first night in the ruins. But his eyes were different, carrying additional weight, additional sorrows, additional centuries of necessary departures. "You shouldn't be here," Margaret said immediately. "If anyone sees you—" "No one is seeing me," Casimir replied calmly. "I'm very good at not being seen when I choose not to be. I came because Eleanor completed her schooling, and I wanted to witness it. I came because I heard from a woman in Dublin that your shop has become a place where other women find work, that you employ 3 seamstresses now, all of them widows or cast-offs, all of them earning money that lets them live on their own terms." "You've been watching us," Margaret said, not accusatory, simply stating fact. "I check in," Casimir acknowledged. "Catherine reports to me. The woman in Dublin reports to me. I have a network of people who keep track of the people I've saved, just to ensure they're flourishing rather than merely surviving." He studied Margaret with an intensity that felt like being truly known. You've done better than flourish, Margaret Ashworth. You've become a monument to defiance. That wasn't the goal, Margaret said. The goal was just to keep Eleanor alive, to keep her safe. And now? Casimir asked. Margaret thought about her daughter, brilliant, fierce, already asking questions about the world that made it clear she was going to demand more from it than it was prepared to give. She thought about the 3 women currently working in her shop, all of them earning enough to live independently of male approval. She thought about the wedding dress in the fitting room, destined for a woman marrying for love instead of security, a radical act in a world that still tried to dictate such choices. Now I'm trying to build a world where other girls don't have to hide in ruins to survive, Margaret said quietly. Casimir smiled. It transformed his face entirely, made him look almost human instead of like a statue carved from marble and centuries. Katerina would have loved you, he said. She believed that mercy wasn't meant to be an individual act. She believed that the saved had a responsibility to become saviors in turn. He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. I need to show you something. I need to show you what your choices have meant. They walked through Edinburgh as the evening light shifted from gold to amber to deep red. Casimir led Margaret through closes and wynds she'd never explored, up staircases that seemed to exist in the margins of the city, until they reached a building she recognized, the bookbinder's shop on the street where Catherine's boarding house had been. Inside, the shop had been converted into something unexpected. Shelves, yes, but not containing books, containing documents, ledgers, photographs. And in the center of the room, an enormous map covered in thread, connections linking different cities, different countries, different names written in careful script. This is a record, Casimir said quietly, of every person saved through the network. Every woman who escaped, every child who survived, every person who chose life over surrender. He pointed to the map. This thread here, it starts with Katerina. My first act of deliberately building something other than myself. This thread here begins with me saving you from Edmund's men in those ruins. And look. He traced his finger through the connections. It branches. You saved yourself and Eleanor. Eleanor will grow up and save others. The women you employ will save themselves and their daughters. You've created a fractal pattern of survival. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She reached out and touched the map, tracing the threads that connected Edinburgh to Vienna, Dublin to London, Prague to Paris. How many? She whispered. So far, 217 people in this generation alone, Casimir said. But it's exponential. It grows. It compounds. In another generation, it could be thousands. Why are you showing me this? Margaret asked. Because you need to know that you are not just a widow who hid in ruins. You are the beginning of something that might, if you and Catherine and everyone else in this network do it right, change what it means for women to survive in a world that would prefer them powerless. Casimir turned to face her. I came here tonight to tell you that your debt is paid. You no longer owe me anything. You've repaid every act of mercy I ever gave you by transforming that mercy into something that spreads. I will never be done owing you, Margaret said fiercely. You gave me my daughter's life. You gave me... And you gave that life to 3 women, Casimir interrupted gently. You gave that life to the woman in Dublin whose story you read and who felt less alone knowing yours. You gave that life to Eleanor, who will grow up believing that women can be autonomous and powerful and whole. He reached out and took Margaret's hands. This is how immortality actually works, Margaret. Not through individual rescue, but through transformation. You are immortal now. Your actions will ripple outward long after you're dead, shaping the choices of people who never knew you existed. They stood in the bookbinder's shop as darkness fell over Edinburgh, and Margaret felt something shift inside her. Not acceptance. She would never fully accept Casimir's departure, would always carry the weight of gratitude for his intervention. But understanding. understanding that the greatest act of love was teaching someone to be independent of your love, teaching them to survive without needing you, teaching them that rescue is only the beginning of the story, not the end. "Where will you go?" Margaret asked. "There is a boy in Prague," Casimir said, 13 years old, who is about to be conscripted into service that will destroy him. There is a woman in Vienna who is slowly being murdered by her family's greed. There is someone in Budapest. I haven't met them yet, but I can hear their suffering from across the continent, and I know I need to be there." He paused. "There is always someone. There will always be someone. As long as the world demands mercy, I will provide it." "Will I see you again?" Margaret asked. "Perhaps," Casimir said. "Perhaps in another 7 years, when Eleanor has grown into the woman she's becoming. Perhaps in 20 years, when your grandchildren are being born and will need their grandmother's wisdom about what it means to be saved and to become savior." He squeezed her hands one final time. "Or perhaps this is goodbye. Either way, know that you will always be in my memory as the woman who transformed survival into purpose. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts." He released her hands and stepped back into the shadows of the bookbinder's shop. And this time, Margaret did not watch him disappear. This time, she turned toward the window, toward the Edinburgh lights, toward the city where she and her daughter had learned to flourish, toward the future that was waiting for them to help build it. When she looked back, he was gone. But the map remained. The connections remained. The thread linking her to everyone she'd saved and everyone they would save in turn remained visible against the darkness. A geometry of grace that would outlast all of them. Eleanor turned 18 on a morning when Edinburgh was covered in unexpected snow. Margaret woke early to make tea and find her daughter already dressed, standing at the window of their small flat above the seamstress shop, watching the snow fall like a blessing. "I've decided," Eleanor said, without preamble. "I'm going to Dublin." Margaret set down the tea carefully. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Eleanor would demand more from the world than Edinburgh could offer. She had been preparing for it since the day Casimir left them in the ruins, knowing that raising a daughter meant eventually raising a woman who would leave. "Catherine told you about the network," Margaret said. "Catherine told me everything," Eleanor confirmed. She turned from the window, and Margaret saw in her face the particular combination of her own features and something else. Something that had no name, but that she recognized as the mark of a life purchased with extraordinary circumstances. "She told me about you, about how you ran from scandal and shame and chose survival instead, about how you transformed your shop into a place of refuge." Eleanor moved to the table and sat across from her mother. At 18, she was taller than Margaret, with dark hair and pale eyes that missed nothing. "She also told me about him," Eleanor continued. "About the man who helped us in the ruins. About Casimir." Margaret felt her hands tighten on her teacup. "That's not a story that belongs to you." "It's exactly a story that belongs to me," Eleanor interrupted gently. "He delivered me. His hands were the first to touch me outside your body. His presence kept me alive when I should have died in childbirth because of your age and your circumstances." Eleanor reached across the table and took her mother's trembling hands. "I want to know him, not as the stranger who saved us, but as the person who represents what I want to become." "He's not a person," Margaret said. "He's something other than human, something immortal and cold and profoundly merciful," Eleanor finished, "and capable of love that demonstrates itself through sacrifice rather than sentiment, and willing to transform survival into purpose across centuries." Eleanor smiled. A strange, ancient smile that made Margaret realize her daughter had somehow inherited far more from their night in the ruins than simple continued existence. "I want to go to Dublin because Catherine says there are women there who need saving. I want to do what you've done, What you've been doing in the shop for 11 years, but on a larger scale. I want to build something." Margaret understood then what Casimir had meant about fractal patterns. Eleanor had been shaped, perhaps in the womb, perhaps in those first fragile days of life in the chapel, by circumstances that had taught her that survival was not enough. That survival was only the foundation upon which something larger could be built. "He came to see you when you were 7, Margaret said. "Did you know that?" "I remember someone very still, very cold," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "I remember him standing across the street and my body knowing not to be afraid, even though my mind couldn't quite make sense of what he was." Eleanor squeezed her mother's hands. "I think that was when I knew I wanted to be like him. Not immortal, necessarily, but capable of that kind of compassion, that kind of discipline, that kind of refusal to let the world tell you who you were supposed to be." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, not sorrowful tears, but the particular tears of a mother watching her daughter move toward her own becoming. "If you go to Dublin," Margaret said, "you'll be walking into danger. Not just scandal, but actual danger. There are men who exploit women, and the work Catherine does, the work we've been doing, it puts you in direct opposition to people who would prefer women remain powerless and broken." "I know," Eleanor said calmly. "I've always known. I think I was born knowing." She paused. "Will you come with me?" Margaret opened her mouth to answer. She had built something here, a shop, a reputation, a network of women who depended on her. She had built a life that was stable and safe and entirely her own. She thought of Casimir, disappearing into the Edinburgh night to answer calls he could hear across the continent. She thought of the letter from the stranger in Vienna, describing the work of saving people as a labor of love that never truly ended. She thought of Katerina, dead for 82 years, but still shaping the choices of people who had never met her. She thought of her daughter, 18 years old, and already understanding that survival was only the beginning. "Yes," Margaret said. "Yes, I'll come with you." They left Edinburgh on a spring morning, leaving the shop in the hands of one of the women Margaret had trained, a widow with 3 children who had earned the right to be trusted with the business. They carried letters of introduction from Catherine, letters that would open doors in Dublin and beyond. They carried the practical skills of survival and the spiritual knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. In Dublin, they found the safe house Catherine had described, a 3-story building that appeared to be a modest boarding house, but that actually functioned as a way station for women fleeing impossible situations. Catherine had arranged everything, down to the room where Eleanor and Margaret would sleep. It was Eleanor who discovered the letter waiting for them, placed on the table in their room. It was written in handwriting Margaret recognized, precise, formal, carrying the weight of centuries in its careful script. "My dear Eleanor, I have been waiting for you to reach this moment, the moment where survival transforms into purpose, where being saved becomes the foundation for saving others. Your mother has borne the responsibility of continuing what I began with extraordinary grace. Now you will take that work and make it something unprecedented. I cannot stay with you. I have never been able to stay. The work is too vast, and I am only one person stretched across centuries. But I want you to know this. The fact of your existence is itself an act of defiance against a world that would have preferred you never drawn breath. You will save people in Dublin. You will transform that work, perhaps, into something that reaches across all of Europe. You will teach other women what your mother taught you, that rescue is only the beginning, that survival is only the foundation, that the true work begins when you decide that what happened to you will not happen to others if you can prevent it. I once told your mother that fear is an indication that you understand the stakes. Fear means you still know what you stand to lose. Let that fear drive you toward mercy. Let it teach you that the most radical act is caring for someone the world has deemed unworthy of care. You carry in your blood the knowledge of a woman who chose survival. You carry in your spirit the presence of everyone I've saved who chose in turn to save others. You are not just Eleanor Ashworth. You are the continuation of a story that began in Prague centuries ago with a woman named Katerina, who decided that immortality meant something other than simple duration. Go forward, build, transform. And when you are old and tired and have saved more people than you can count, remember that someone much colder and much older than you has been watching and has never been anything but proud. See, Eleanor read the letter aloud, her voice steady and clear. When she finished, she looked at her mother with tears streaming down her face, not tears of sorrow, but tears of the weight and the wonder of what they were about to become. "We're going to be extraordinary," Eleanor said simply. "We already are," Margaret replied. "We've been extraordinary since the night he wrapped his cloak around us in the ruins." Together they walked to the window and looked out over Dublin, a city full of women who didn't yet know they were about to be saved, full of stories about to be rewritten, full of possibility and mercy and the terrible, beautiful knowledge that some broken things can be transformed into weapons of redemption. 23 years later, Margaret stood in a cemetery in Vienna, attending a funeral of a woman she had never met. She was 61 years old now, gray at the temples, her hands marked with the silver lines of decades spent with needle and thread. Eleanor stood beside her, a woman of 41, carrying herself with the particular authority of someone who has spent 2 decades transforming the impossible into the inevitable. The funeral was for a girl, barely 25, with a child of her own, who had been one of Eleanor's earliest rescues in Dublin. The girl had survived, had built a life in Vienna with a kind man and a secure home, had borne a daughter who was now 10 years old and thriving in ways that the society pages called unprecedented for someone of her circumstances. The girl had died of the same complications that had nearly killed Margaret 23 years earlier, during the birth of a second child. But this time, she had survived the birth. It was the blood infection that came after that took her. As they stood at the graveside, Eleanor reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. Neither of them were crying. They had learned, over the past 2 decades, that tears were a luxury reserved for people who hadn't yet understood that death is part of the work. That saving someone doesn't mean saving them from mortality. It means giving them the tools to choose how they spend their finite time. After the funeral, a man approached them. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying the weight of centuries. Margaret recognized him immediately, recognized the cold perfection of his features, the way the world seemed to part around him slightly, as if nature itself understood he was something other than merely human. Casimir had come to the funeral. "I wanted to see where she ended," he said quietly. "I wanted to understand what happened to the girl Eleanor saved in Dublin when she was terrified and uncertain if she could actually change anything." "She lived," Eleanor said simply. "She had a husband who loved her. She had a daughter who is going to be a doctor. She's already been accepted to medical school, which apparently no one thought a girl born under such circumstances could achieve." Eleanor paused. "She had a life worth living." "Yes," Casimir agreed. "She did. That's precisely the point." He turned to Margaret, and she saw in his expression something she had never quite seen before: recognition, equality. As if, in the 23 years since he'd left them in the ruins, she had somehow become his peer rather than his rescued victim. "You were right," he said to Margaret. "When you asked me who I was in that first night, you asked as if you already suspected the answer. You knew, somehow, what I was and what you would have to become to survive knowing me." He turned to look at the grave. "Eleanor has done extraordinary work, but so have you. You built the foundation. You showed her what it meant to transform mercy into action." "I did what I had to do," Margaret said. "I survived, and then I helped others survive. That's not extraordinary. That's just necessity. No, Casimir said gently. That is the definition of extraordinary. That is love demonstrating itself through sustained action across decades. He reached into his coat and withdrew 2 letters. These came to me through the network, he said, from people you've touched. Women in Budapest who started a school for girls deemed unsuitable for education. A man in Warsaw whose mother was saved by Eleanor and who has spent the last 15 years creating legal frameworks to protect women in vulnerable positions. A girl in Prague, 11 years old, who told Catherine that she wants to grow up to do exactly what Eleanor does. He placed the letters in Eleanor's hands. This is what I came to tell you, Casimir continued. That the work you began, the work Margaret began, really, the night she chose survival over surrender in those ruins, has become something I can no longer contain within my own labor. It has become bigger than any one person, even someone who has lived for 3 centuries. What does that mean? Margaret asked. It means that the debt is paid, Casimir said. It means that you are no longer people who were saved. You are saviors now. You are the foundation upon which others will build. It means that I can finally, after so long, stop carrying the weight alone. He looked at both of them, mother and daughter, mortal and finite, carrying the marks of survival in the silver of their hair and the authority in their bearing. Katerina told me, when she was dying, that she believed the work of mercy should never be the responsibility of a single person across centuries, Casimir said quietly. She believed that the goal should be to make the work so necessary, so vital, so deeply woven into the fabric of human compassion that it became something all people participated in, not just the immortal and the desperate. He paused. You have done that. In 23 years, you have created a network of ordinary people, not vampires, not the magically rescued, just ordinary women and men who believe that saving lives is part of what it means to be human. What will you do? Eleanor asked. Casimir smiled, that terrible, beautiful smile that transformed him entirely. I will finally go to rest, he said. Katerina taught me that eternity is a burden when it lacks purpose. But you have given me purpose one final time by proving that purpose can outlast even me. So I will retire. I will find a place in the mountains, somewhere quiet, somewhere where the work can continue without my direct involvement. I will live the final centuries of my unnatural existence, knowing that the mercy I've spent my whole immortal life building will continue without me. Margaret reached out and took his hand. His skin was cold. It had always been cold, would always be cold. But underneath that coldness, she felt the pulse of something that had spent centuries trying to be human in the only ways an immortal could manage. Thank you, she said, for everything, for saving us, for teaching me that survival is an act of love, for reminding me every day that I've spent in this work, that broken things can become extraordinary. No, Casimir said. Thank you, for proving that I wasn't wasting my time, for showing me that mercy is not a burden, but a gift, for becoming the kind of woman that reminds me why Katerina believed in the possibility of redemption. He released Margaret's hand and turned to leave. But Eleanor called out one final time. Casimir. He paused. What will you do with all that time? Eleanor asked. All those centuries ahead of you with no one to save? Casimir looked back at them, this mother and daughter who had transformed his mercy into purpose, who had taken his rescue and turned it into a revolution of compassion that would ripple through generations yet unborn. I will remember, he said. I will remember every person I've saved. I will remember every moment of mercy I've enacted. I will remember Katerina and the violin, and the 8 years that were worth more than centuries. And perhaps, toward the end, I will finally understand what it means to be grateful for having been cursed. He disappeared into the Vienna evening, not literally, but completely nonetheless. Margaret and Eleanor stood at the graveside, watching the space where he had been, and they understood what he had given them. Not just survival, but permission. Permission to build something. Permission to continue the work without guilt. Permission to become the heroes of their own story. That night, Eleanor made tea the way Margaret had taught her, carefully, intentionally, with the kind of presence that turned a simple act into ritual. They sat in the apartment Catherine had provided in Vienna, and they opened the letters Casimir had given them. They read stories of lives saved, lives transformed, lives that had become the foundation for other lives being saved and transformed in turn. They read about a girl in Prague who wanted to grow up to be like Eleanor. They read about a man in Warsaw who was rewriting his country's laws to protect women. They read about a woman in Budapest who was teaching girls that education was resistance. And when they finished reading, Margaret placed her hand on Eleanor's shoulder and spoke the words that had become their covenant, their prayer, their purpose. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, and every mortal who chooses to save others becomes immortal in their own way. Through the lives they touch, the futures they change, the mercy they teach their daughters to continue. Eleanor nodded and reached up to place her hand over her mother's. Together they sat in silence while Vienna breathed around them, a city full of women who were about to be saved, full of stories about to be rewritten, full of the particular possibility that comes when mercy becomes contagion, when survival becomes revolution, when the work of love is finally, at last, shared among all who believe in it. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned.